It was a bleak and dreary evening in late November when Sherlock Holmes and I, Dr. John Watson, sat before a roaring fire in our rooms at 221B Baker Street. The rain lashed against the windows, and the gas lamps outside flickered in the wind. Holmes, ever the picture of detached brilliance, was engaged in his usual pastime of examining tobacco ash samples, while I read the latest edition of the Strand magazine. Our quiet was interrupted by a frantic knocking at the door. Mrs. Hudson, her expression concerned, ushered in a man soaked to the bone. He was tall, gaunt, and trembling, his clothes bedraggled, and his face pale as death itself. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, his voice trembling. "I beg of you, help me." Holmes rose at once, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the man's appearance. "You have come far and quickly," he remarked, motioning for the man to sit. "Watson, fetch a blanket for our guest." As I draped the blanket over the man's shivering shoulders, Holmes continued, "Your boots are caked with sea salt, and your coat bears the unmistakable scent of brine. You are from the coast, are you not?" "Indeed, Mr. Holmes," the man replied. "My name is Captain Reginald Harcourt, and I am the keeper of the Blackstone Lighthouse. Strange and terrible things have been happening there, sir, things I cannot explain. I fear for my life and the lives of my crew." "Calm yourself, Captain," Holmes said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Start at the beginning and tell us everything." "The Blackstone Lighthouse stands on a rocky isle off the Devonshire coast," Harcourt began, his voice quavering. "It has guided ships through treacherous waters for over a century. I have been its keeper for 20 years, and never have I seen anything like this. It began a fortnight ago. A thick fog settled over the lighthouse, denser than any I have ever known. That night we heard screams, terrible, inhuman screams, coming from the rocks below. When we searched, we found nothing but the tide lapping against the stones. The next night, the screams returned, and with them came shadows. Dark shapes moved through the fog, flickering like ghosts. My crew is terrified, Mr. Holmes. One of them, young Charlie Briggs, disappeared 3 nights ago. We found his lantern smashed on the rocks, but no trace of him. Last night, I saw myself," Harcourt whispered, "a figure, tall and cloaked, standing on the rocks. It pointed toward the lighthouse, and though I could not see its face, I felt its malice. When I approached, it vanished into the fog." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "A fascinating case," he said. "Watson, pack your things. We leave for Blackstone Lighthouse at once." The journey to the Devonshire coast was long and arduous, the stormy weather adding to the sense of foreboding. We arrived at the small harbor town of Greyhaven by nightfall, where a boat waited to take us to the lighthouse. The boatman, a wiry man with weathered features, eyed us warily as we boarded. "Keep your wits about you," he warned. "Blackstone's cursed. Always has been." As we approached the lighthouse, its silhouette loomed dark and foreboding against the churning sea. The beam of its light swept across the water, its steady rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos of the waves below. Captain Harcourt introduced us to the remaining crew. Elias Trent, an older, grizzled man who had served as a keeper for decades, and Peter Shore, a young assistant with wide, frightened eyes. Both men seemed tense, their gazes darting to the windows. Holmes wasted no time. "Captain Harcourt, show us the scene where young Briggs disappeared." We were led to the rocks below the lighthouse, where the tide crashed violently against the jagged stones. Holmes examined the broken lantern, his magnifying glass glinting in the weak light of the overcast sky. "Curious," he murmured. The glass was shattered outward, suggesting an explosion or a sudden force. "And these footprints?" He crouched, tracing the faint marks on the rocks. "2 sets, one belonging to Briggs and another larger, heavier. They lead toward the water, but do not return. Could he have fallen into the sea?" I asked. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, his tone thoughtful. but I suspect there is more to this than meets the eye. That night, as the storm raged outside, Holmes and I sat in the lighthouse's common room with Harcourt and his crew. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the beam of the lighthouse cast long, flickering shadows. "Tell me," Holmes said, addressing Trent and Shore, "have you noticed anything unusual about the fog?" Trent nodded grimly. "It's not natural. It clings to the lighthouse like a living thing, and it doesn't move with the wind." Before Holmes could reply, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. We leapt to our feet, grabbing lanterns and rushing outside. The fog was thick, swirling around us like a living entity. Through the haze, we saw a figure standing on the rocks, its cloak billowing in the wind. It pointed toward the lighthouse, just as Harcourt had described. "Who goes there?" Holmes called, his voice cutting through the storm. The figure did not respond, but began to move away, disappearing into the fog. "After it," Holmes commanded, and we gave chase. The pursuit was harrowing. The rocks were slick with rain, and the fog seemed to close in around us, distorting sounds and shapes. We followed the faint echo of footsteps until we reached a hidden cove where a small, weathered boat was moored. Holmes examined the boat with swift precision. "Smuggler's craft," he muttered. "Notice the markings on the hull. It's been used to transport cargo, likely contraband." A sudden noise behind us made us spin around. From the shadows emerged a man, his face partially obscured by a scarf. In his hand, he held a pistol. "Stay where you are," he growled. Holmes, undeterred, stepped forward. "You must be the mastermind behind this charade," he said coolly. The fog, the screams, the disappearance of young Briggs. It was all a ruse to frighten the keepers and keep them away from this cove, was it not? The man's eyes narrowed. "You talk too much." Before he could act, Trent appeared from the fog, wielding a heavy lantern. With a swift motion, he struck the man's arm, sending the pistol clattering to the ground. Together, we subdued him and brought him back to the lighthouse. Under Holmes's sharp interrogation, the man confessed. His name was Victor Kane, a notorious smuggler who had been using the cove to hide his illicit goods. To keep the lighthouse keepers from discovering his activities, he had created the Eerie fog using a chemical contraption hidden near the shore, amplified by the natural conditions of the area.